Ladies and gents, welcome back to the core of everything. And after a brief hiatus, I'd love to welcome back Mark Boyd.
I'm
Um,
glad it's nice to be here as co-host and not guest. Is that true?
yeah,
Is that
yeah.
what capacity I'm here in?
Combination of the two. It's good to have you back. Lightning does strike twice, and that's a really, really good
What a
joke.
segue.
That's a really good joke because today we're looking at a lightning-based phenomena
Mm,
which is associated with your PhD, known as fulgurites.
absolutely. Fulgurites from the Latin, because we like a bit of classical input. We're educated folks here on the core of everything. From the Latin fulgur, meaning lightning. Um, Fulgurites are fossilized lightning. So big picture stuff. Across the world, there's about 45 lightning strikes per second worldwide, which is quite a lot.
A lot.
And it's thought that based on, so not all of those happen over land and not all of them have the right conditions, but it's thought that those 45 strikes per second probably convert into 10 fulgurites forming globally per second. And I'll explain what a fulgurite is in more detail in a bit. Um, but basically, these things are probably quite kind of prevalent. And we actually think there was a paper by Gora et al. In 2020 that suggested that some, particularly around the tropics, some land masses receive upwards of 100 cloud to ground lightning strikes per kilometre squared per year. So our planet does get hit quite a lot by lightning strikes.
Hmm. So, what is a fulgurite then? How's that relate to geology?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, yeah. So basically, I mean, they're these amazing things because they can effectively capture this insanely high power phenomenon. So when lightning strikes the ground, it releases over 1 million volts and up to about 100,000 amps. It heats the air to about 30,000 Kelvin, and it heats the ground to about 3,000 Kelvin. And so, what happens when you heat the ground? What happens when you heat rock? Well, you melt stuff, and if it's hot enough, you'll vaporize it as well. And the result you get from that melted and vaporized material is a fulgurite. So effectively, it's that melted material that then solidifies and cools very quickly and forms a glass. Um, so I think we talked about this on the podcast before, but like a glass in geology is basically something that forms or it cools very, very quickly from a melt. So like obsidian, for example.
So is fulgurite obsidian, or is it slightly different?
So it's normally it depends what it forms from, but typically it will form from quartz, and so it's normally just silica. Um, the main mineral is so there's different forms of like silica glasses based on the temperatures and pressures that they're formed at. One of them is Le Chatellierite.
Say it again.
Le Chatellierite.
Le
I have
Chatellierite.
I've practiced that. Based on or named after Henry Louis Le Chatelier, which, if you've done chemistry A level, I think there was something called Le Chatelier's principle, which was all about equilibrium.
Yeah.
Um, don't ask me to go into any more detail than that, but basically,
Is
fulgurites
it
have this what we call a mineraloid. Because it's not actually a mineral because it's a glass, so it
right?
doesn't have that repeating structure, but it's effectively just made of silica. Um,
So these fulgurites, they have no fixed composition because it depends on what they strike, what the lightning strikes, and that
yeah,
lightning then forms a not lightning forms a glass.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, it seems to be that most of the ways that these things form is when they hit sand, so like deserts or
Yeah.
beaches and things like that. So actually, most of the ones we have are silica glasses, and it's possible that the way that they form it, actually silica is the best thing to form them. So there might, other things might just get vaporized too much, like carbonates, for example. Um, and so what you get is actually a lot of this vapor escaping, and it leaves like effectively a hollow channel, and then these kind of branching structures.
Does the ground, because obviously this is a lightning strike, the ground has to be a relatively good conductor, no, to form fulgurites, whereas silica, SiO2, it's not a good conductor. It's very poor. So
Yeah,
how is that one cooked more so than an igneous rock or you know, a
yeah.
metamorphic rock?
I mean, I think because the power is so high from a lightning strike, it will effectively force its way through rocks like whatever their composition. So there's this concept called rock breakdown strengths, and that's effectively like I think it's how many volts per meter you need to like break down your rock, and I think for them to conduct. And so a lot of these are normally on the like one to sort of on the million volt scale, which is the scale with which lightning strikes are happening. So they're enough to kind of break down most rocks. But yeah, I mean, it all depends on what target you're hitting. So there's a few different types of fulgurites. You've got sand fulgurites, as I said, when they hit beaches, deserts, things like that, and the current will flow through low resistance pathways. So the main thing for that you need is water. So if you've got something that's quite permeable or got good porosity that's holding water in it, then it will conduct quite well. And what you get with these is you get a point where the lightning strikes the ground and then it spreads out normally when it finds the water table. And you get these kind of like branching structures that are lined with glass, which is normally like black or dark gray. And they're hollow in the center where all that vapor has just escaped. But interestingly, on the outside, they're covered in sand grains because you get basically a temperature gradient. So think super hot on the inside, stuff just volatilizes and escape. And then you form your glass where stuff has melted. And then on the outside of the fulgurites, you've partially melted stuff, but not everything's melted. And so actually you get some sand grains like getting stuck in the walls of your fulgurite. So they're basically like sandpaper once you dig them out.
They're like veins,
Yeah,
or roots where you have these lightning roots going into the sand, and then
yeah, yeah,
yeah, they're hollow in the inside where, well, I guess nothing travels through them, but water could, I guess.
yeah,
They're very permeable.
yeah. It feels
That's
like you
very
could
cool.
make a recorder out of them or a flute.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That feels like quite a fun project, but obviously, as a geologist, you want to preserve the material. Um, I'm putting my museum hat on now.
No, no, yeah. It'd be quite striking, wouldn't it? Uh,
Really.
yeah, that's really interesting. So that's a typical Fulbright. I imagine what I'm struggling to understand is it requires water and so you're talking most of them in deserts where they form, but there's not a load of water in deserts. The water table would be extremely deep if there was one. So how does the lightning reach the water table? Or does it in these areas? Does it require there to be have been rainfall recently in the desert?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to be honest, like that current from your lightning strike, 100,000 amps, has to go somewhere. And
Mm.
so even if it can't reach the water table, it's just gonna find whatever route it can, and that might be like slight defects in your rocks that it's hitting, or in the sand. But I imagine, I guess when the water table's shallower, what you'd get is like a bit of depth, and then it would spread out quite horizontally. Whereas maybe if it can't find those pathways, it just goes straight down. Perhaps. So I've seen in the Natural History Museum, there's one that's 16 feet long, which is about 5 meters.
A singular
Um,
tube that's
I
16
think
feet long.
one singular
Wow.
fulgurite. But these are mostly these sand ones. You also get rock fulgurites. So that's when, imagine you've got like I don't know, a granite, for example, and lightning strikes that. You've not got the same. It doesn't form these kind of branching root-like structures. It more forms like pits that are lined with this dark glass. So mountains are effectively natural lightning rods, and good place to find these things.
Wow.
Um,
So there's the types. So there's a rock and a sand fulgurite.
Rock and sand.
Okay.
There's kind of pseudo fulgurites because you can get anthropogenic ones. So imagine you've got like power lines, um, and your power line falls over, and then starts pumping current into the ground, and you can actually form fulgurites that way, um,
Really?
which is pretty
Wonder
cool.
what they would look like. Hmm.
Well, I guess if you're so, I think power lines would last for longer, but would the energy I think is not as great as a lightning strike. So
Mm.
basically, you're saying your fulgurite's probably going to be bigger because it's you can heat more stuff, more rock or sand, but you're maybe not going to melt or volatilize, or you're definitely not going to volatilize as much stuff because the peak temperatures aren't as high. So actually, it might not have that same like hollow through the middle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And people have tried to make them in labs as well, which is
Well,
quite cool.
they would work really nicely as a lamp.
No, labs.
Oh, labs. Or maybe it was a lamp. I mean,
But
it'd
yeah,
look
that's
nice as a
true.
lamp. It'd be lovely,
And
yeah.
I'm sure I'm sure this is like a world of art.
Yeah, Fulgurite. Um, how do you make it in a lab? I guess you're gonna have to generate plasma or something like that to create pr- temperatures high enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they do is they basically just have two electrodes and they put a massive voltage difference across them, which is basically what lightning is, right? You've got your clouds building up a voltage, and then I don't know what the voltage of the Earth's surface is, maybe it's just zero. And it wants to discharge. So I think what they do is they've got these two electrodes and they put the rock sample in the middle.
So those are the general characteristics of fulgurites. They have
Yeah, so root-like, you might see a little protrusion above the earth in the desert or on a beach, and then sometimes you actually get like little micro droplets within this melted material and like bubbles. And fulgurites are interesting because the events that create them are so unique that you actually can find new minerals, perhaps because they're so high temperature, probably high pressure as well. And you find various quite exotic minerals, things like iron silicides. So that's iron and silicon compounds.
I
Um,
imagine those are also found in some meteorites because of the impacts between them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's comparisons here to things like impact cratering and also trinitite. Do you know about trinitite?
Not really.
So trinitite is a silica glass that formed when they were testing the nuclear weapons in New Mexico. And these were like plateaus of sand. I think it was white. The area was called White Sands, and they were testing, these events that were hugely high temperature and high pressure, melting quartz sand and forming effectively a new type of quartz glass,
Wow,
uh, which is
that's
crazy.
cool. That's very cool. I'd imagine they can only be found in Los Alamos or
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Hiroshima or somewhere where they've had a nuclear bomb or nuclear events. Cool. Cool. One thing I was going to ask
Mm,
is maybe this is jumping the gun a bit, but with fulgurites, you need lightning. So what are the oldest kind of fulgurites? Because could they be a paleo indicator for lightning? You know, lightning requires the troposphere. It requires a charge of, say, cloud and air in the charge of the ground to interact. So it must have shown the oldest fulgurite must be an indicator for when the atmosphere started to divide into different layers.
yeah, yeah. I love that. Yeah, so true. And as I always like to do, like expanding it to planetary stuff as well. Like we think there are electrical discharges in the Venusian clouds, perhaps. The question is, are these reaching the ground? Could they be forming fulgurites? Um, but you're absolutely right. Like, and this is part of my research is trying to use these kind of materials to understand how the climate and the environment's changed in the past. And actually, there was some modeling done. So this was a paper by Hess et al., published in Nature Comms in 2021. So this was a group from Leeds, and they were looking at trying to work out whether or how fulgurites were forming on the early Earth. Um, and they suggested that there were between 1 to 5 billion lightning flashes per year on the early Earth. So this is a huge amount of lightning. Compare that to modern day. So a study by Wong et al. In Astrobiology 2017 suggested that we have 560 million per year, which is
Wow,
still a lot,
that's a lot.
but there was more lightning in the past.
How early is early Earth? Because Earth originally was magma oceans and um, not a lot of silica. Well, there probably was silica, but
Yeah,
not as much as we have today in the deserts in terms of their pockets of unbelievably quartz rich.
yeah, yeah. I guess we're talking kind of the Archean, so 3.5 to 4 billion years ago.
Okay.
So I think the Hadean was kind of this almost hellish landscape that you described, the magma ocean and once you started to actually get some surfaces. But they're interesting. I mean, the problem is like fulgurites are really fragile. So if you think you found one like don't just yank it up out the ground. Like it's where you want your kind of archaeological trowel and brush. So they're probably not that well preserved. But what's quite interesting about them is that we think they might have had quite a important role in releasing like bioavailable elements on the early Earth. So what I mean by that is there are certain things like phosphorus, which typically might be locked up in rocks and not able to be used by organisms or whatever to fulfill organic like mechanisms and things that help things live. A lot of the phosphorus was thought to come from meteorites, but this paper by Hess et al. In Nature Comms was suggesting that fulgurites, when they formed, they could, if they were had any phosphorus in them, they could change that phosphorus from phosphate, which you can't really use or organisms couldn't use, to phosphides and phosphites. And you would form minerals like schreibersite, and which is like an iron nickel and phosphorus containing mineral. And the good thing about schreibersite is it's soluble in water. So when your water comes in, it can actually release the phosphorus from that. So the suggestion by this paper is that actually lightning was a potentially quite a key mechanism on the early Earth for releasing things like phosphorus into the environment for early organisms to use. The problem is that the Earth erases the trace of early things.
because they're delicate and the earth changes and it's
Yeah,
dynamic and things get destroyed and metamorphosed or melted and
yeah, yeah,
chucked into the mantle.
um, yeah.
Darwin.
Darwin. So we talked about like the oldest Fulgurites, but the oldest in another sense, the kind of the most historical ones we have had. So Darwin, on his Beagle visit or tour expedition, he collected mostly like life science specimens, bugs, birds, plants, things like that. But he did collect a few geological specimens. And some of those were fulgurites. So these came from a place called Maldonado, which is kind of a coastal town, or now a city, in Uruguay. And can I read you a little bit of what he said about
Please,
this
yeah, please.
diary? So he said, in a broad band of sand hillocks, I love the word hillock, in a broad band of sand hillocks which separate the Laguna del Potrero from the shores of the Plata, at the distance of a few miles from Maldonado, I found a group of those vitrified siliceous tubes which are formed by lightning entering loose sand. The sand hillocks of Maldonado, not being protected by vegetation, are constantly changing their position. From this cause, the tubes projected above the surface. 4 sets entered the sand perpendicularly. By working with my hands, I traced one of them 2 feet deep. These dimensions are, however, small compared to those of the tubes from Drigg, one of which was traced to a depth of not less than 30 feet. So Drigg is up in Cumbria, and those are some of the first fulgurites to have been found in the UK. And so I suspect Darwin would have seen them before he went and then went to Uruguay. So yeah, quite a
Yeah.
poetic explanation of some of
How
those
was he
falls.
able to identify the fulgurite? Or maybe he didn't have a word. Maybe it wasn't quite the term fulgurite was existing then, but
Yeah, I think these things just look so alien,
mm,
and particularly like finding glasses. To form glasses, you need melting, you need high temperatures, and so that narrows your options down quite a lot. Volcanics, impacts. Um, but I think, and particularly like that, he actually went on to say that he says within them there might be a number of minute entangled air or perhaps steam bubbles. So this is where when all that the gases are like volatilizing and escaping, it forms all these bubbles. But
mm,
clearly he didn't completely know what they were. Um,
very
but
cool.
yeah, a strange thing.
So we've already talked about how it's important through maybe being a paleo indicator for
Mm.
climates.
Mm.
How else are fulgurites used as for importance? Is it simply a climatic indicator, or is there more?
Yeah, I mean, I think they it's something that's not widely known about. I would say it's kind of this,
Well, I didn't know about it, and I studied geology for 10.
and you're a bright lad.
Thank you. I've studied geology for like 15 years or something. So like
Yeah,
I student and we're friends and we've talked for a lot for years and
yeah,
and I think you've given a talk on it as well and I still couldn't retain it. So
yeah.
uh, sorry about that, but
Clearly wasn't captivating enough. Um, yeah, but no, I mean, like, so I think to some extent they are just a curiosity at the moment. But they do because it's such a unique um, process that forms them. I think looking at things like the new minerals that they're forming, how they can fix and release certain elements, and yeah, as you say, the big one is the paleo. So something I'd be interested to learn about is whether these things can be preserved in the rock record and what they might look like.
mm,
Problem is that glass doesn't really like to sit around for millions of years, so it changes
no.
very quickly.
I guess you can look at places like Greenland, perhaps, where they have the oldest
Mm.
rocks that have been not metamorphosed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Um, but I mean, it would be great if you found a fulgurite in Greenland, then if you know what rock it's come from and how old that rock is, and then you can say, well, wherever on the globe Greenland is, when this rock formed, like that there had to be lightning strikes, that there was
yeah.
probably stormy weather.
Well, I imagine I'm
Um,
looking at like banded iron formations because they're
mm,
rich in silica anyway. So they
mm,
could
mm,
maybe preserving some fulgurites. Who knows?
yeah, or even like the kind of pseudomorphs,
Yeah,
not necessarily the fulgurite itself, but it's been replaced by something. Um,
cool.
yeah,
Have you got a what in the world this week?
I do. So my what in the world? It's not really about fulgurites, a bit different, but it's. Have you heard of racetrack plier?
No, I don't know what that is.
This is
Does that matter that I haven't heard of it?
no, it doesn't matter. No, this is your side of the pond, in Death Valley, California. Although I feel like maybe we're closer than you are to California.
No, I think I must be surely. Must be surely.
I don't know. America's quite big.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
There's
it's
my
kind of, yeah. It's
hot
quite
take
grand.
for the week. Yeah.
Go on. What is?
So racetrack playa is a dry lake. So it's a lake that's basically dried up. Evaporation is exceeding recharge. Not really any vegetation. Lots of desiccation cracks. The classic like dry environment.
Desiccation
Um,
cracks, for everyone that doesn't know, is just the cracking of basically mud that you see in a dry field, where they contract and form these little cracks.
it
Continue.
feels like quite a movie moment when like the
Ah,
protagonist
Bug's Life is what I was
wait.
thinking of.
Oh yeah,
They
yeah.
cross the stream and they fall in. They jump into the
It's like
desiccation
their
cracks
cabins.
to protect themselves from the bird.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
so good. Anyway, on this playa, on this dry lake, they found stones, and the stones had like tracks behind them up to like 500 meters. Um, and so they were like, well, are these stones like racing across? And the stones have come from the surrounding mountains. They're like dolomites and cyanites. Um, so igneous rocks, but no one's ever seen these rocks move. But we know they do move because people have gone back and be like, oh, this rock is in a different place to where I last saw it. Until a study in 2014 by the Slithering Stones Research Initiative. So these were two guys who were they were either brothers or cousins, James and Richard Norris, and they basically added GPS to some of the rocks, which is
That's
great.
great.
And what they found was, so this is research that was published in the Public Library of Science One journal, and what they found was that in the rainy season you get a very thin veneer of ice, sort of millimeters thick, forming over this lake, this dry lake, and then as it kind of melts, you get, or even with the ice, you get this slightly kind of lower frictional surface, and then when the wind blows the rocks just slide along and
Right.
then it melts, goes away, and then you're left with these kind of tracks. And they found that actually some of these boulders move more than 5 meters in a minute.
Oh, blimey.
So they're
That's a
going,
lot of wind.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So effectively, I think they also called them like sailing stones, and they leave these tracks behind them.
So they must be all going in the similar direction because they just get determined by the direction of the wind.
Yeah, I
It's
guess whatever
really
the
cool.
prevailing wind is. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's a great one.
So good little mystery that was solved.
That's
Um,
great. That's great. Yeah, I imagine they put like a little Garmin watch on it or
Yeah,
a Whoop. You
like
know.
I'm imagining like a dog collar with like a kind of tracking
Yeah,
device.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Mark,
Yeah,
it's good to have you back. I have to say.
it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry it's been so long, but you've
No.
been ably holding the fort in my absence. Do if you've not yet, do check out the previous three episodes that
Been running solo. Been running
feature
solo.
Jack
But
running
yeah,
solo with some amazing guests. So we'd really recommend.
fantastic. Yes. Next week we'll be talking about human evolution. So stay tuned.
Buckle up and don't change too much in the next week.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Jack. Always a pleasure.